On the first Saturday of September, the Flaxborough Allotment Society's annual produce show was judged and displayed in the draughty parish hall. The event was as reliable as the seasons and twice as competitive. Each year it produced the same mixture of civic pride, mild deceit, and an alarming quantity of sponge cake. That morning the air was damp and warm, smelling faintly of chrysanthemums and damp corduroy. Villagers queued to enter with wicker baskets, enamel trays, and the occasional lopsided trug. Old men stood guard over their marrows as if they were crown jewels. Women whispered sharply about the jam table, where the difference between triumph and humiliation could rest upon the neatness of a paraffin seal. Mrs. Hopgood, secretary of the society, bustled between the tables, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She took names with all the severity of a customs officer and allowed no one to cross her path without accounting for their gooseberries. Mr. Riddle, the chairman, hovered at her elbow in a state of permanent nervousness, as though any moment he might be asked to adjudicate on a courgette scandal beyond his powers. It was during the awarding of prizes that the peculiar thing occurred. At the far end of the hall, among the root vegetables, a murmur began not of admiration, but of dismay. Mrs. Mallory, who had entered her husband's cherished collection of onions, stood pale and speechless before the display. The onions, once plump and polished to a mahogany sheen, now sagged and oozed, as though they had been left to rot in a drain. There was a gasp when someone remarked that the smell was not entirely vegetal. Mr. Hopgood, bending close, announced in his baritone that it was brandy. The onions had been neatly injected with liquor. "A disgrace," said Mrs. Hopgood, her voice rising to a pitch reserved for public scandal. The incident might have ended there, with mutterings and recriminations, had not young George Blakey, a boy of 10, thin as a beanpole and eager to impress, pulled at Constable Malley's sleeve. "There's a man lying down in the shed behind the hall," he whispered. "Won't get up when I poke him." The shed, usually given over to spare trestle tables and stacks of bunting, was now occupied by a body. A man in his late 50s, known to many present as Mr. Horace Dew, lay on his back among the dust sheets. His hat had rolled aside, his spectacles were crooked, and his complexion had taken on that decisive stillness which discourages optimism. Constable Malley, alarmed but officious, ordered the hall cleared. The women protested, the men speculated, and Mrs. Hopgood demanded to know who would guard the silver cup. When Inspector Purbright arrived, summoned from the station where he had been sorting a pile of burglary reports with his usual patient gloom, the scene was curiously quiet. The villagers had arranged themselves in knots upon the pavement outside, where they watched each other as much as they awaited news. Purbright entered the hall with his steady tread. He listened to Malley's account without interruption, then went to the shed. He regarded the late Mr. Dew with the calmness of one who has long accepted that death appears in all the least dignified corners of life. Nothing about the body suggested haste. The man lay in his Sunday suit, his tie only slightly askew, his shoes neatly laced. It was the eyes, half open, that gave the only untidiness. Purbright stooped, observed, and straightened. Back in the hall, the produce remained on its tables, incongruously festive. The giant marrows gleamed like ceremonial clubs. The victorious sponges trembled in the draught. Purbright asked quietly who had last seen Mr. Dew. Mrs. Mallory declared she had spoken with him only an hour before, when he was admiring her chrysanthemums with a gallantry rather out of keeping with his reputation. Others confirmed he had been in good spirits, though one or two hinted that he had enemies, as any man in possession of an enviable plot of land and a knack for cucumbers must. By the time the coroner's van arrived, the gossip had already blossomed across the square. Mr. Dew was said to have been poisoned, strangled, and shot in rapid succession. His demise was linked variously to his onions, his allotment boundaries, and his alleged fondness for another man's wife. Inspector Purbright took none of these suggestions at face value. He knew that Flaxborough, like all market towns, could turn a withered onion into a scandal fit for Parliament. He left the hall with his notebook unopened and his expression as mild as ever. Only the faint narrowing of his eyes suggested he had observed something among the marrows and chrysanthemums that troubled his orderly mind. By the time dusk began to spread across Flaxborough, the Allotment Society's hall had been emptied of its marrows, sponges, and outraged matrons. The spectacle had shifted, as it always did in such matters, from the scene of calamity to the parlours, bars, and shop counters where opinion dressed itself as evidence. Word had travelled from the square to the lanes before Constable Malley had finished fastening the shed door. At the Lamb and Flag, the first pints of the evening were drunk to the memory of Horace Dew, who, according to Mr. Bartlett the butcher, had been a man of unpredictable temper, particularly where cabbage whites were concerned. He recalled a heated exchange only last summer when Dew had accused him of losing moths from his van across the allotments. Bartlett, stout and unshakable in most things, admitted that Horace had seemed quite deranged. The company agreed that death softened few men, and Horace's would likely not prove an exception. Mrs. Mallory, meanwhile, was having her version set in type at Mrs. Glossop's hairdressing salon, where half a dozen ladies sat with curlers clamped to their heads like a committee of attentive owls. She described with the detail of one who both suffers and savours indignity how her onions had been disgraced and how, not an hour later, the very man who had praised her chrysanthemums lay expiring among the bunting. Mrs. Glossop, whose scissors punctuated every remark with a sharp snip, pronounced it highly significant. A man did not flatter flowers unless he meant to deceive. Across town, in the cluttered back room of the stationer's, Mr. Viner was drafting a letter to the local paper, deploring the degeneration of village morals. He intended to draw a line from the decay of civic spirit to the injection of onions with intoxicants. Horace Dew, he observed to his cat, had become a casualty of wider decline. The cat showed little interest in the collapse of public virtue, preferring the string from the paper bundles. Purbright, that evening, sat quietly at his desk in the police station, his lamp throwing a pale circle upon an otherwise neglected mound of files. He had taken the statements with his customary politeness, though he preferred to hear people in their natural settings, surrounded by their familiar excuses and their small hypocrisies. For now he had noted only the obvious Horace Dew, long a fixture of the allotment paths, had collapsed without struggle. There were no signs of violence, a heart perhaps worn out by years of labour, or something slipped more quietly into his constitution. Constable Malley, brimming with conclusions, declared it was common knowledge that Dew had enemies on every side of his allotment. Only last week, Malley said, he had broken up a quarrel between Dew and Mr. Jenkin over a disputed strip of ground no wider than a boot scraper. Jenkin had muttered that Horace would come to a bad end. Malley recited this in a tone that implied the remark was practically a confession. Purbright, however, merely asked if Jenkin had been among the onion displays. Malley could not recall. The inspector had no taste for dramatic leaps. He preferred, like a gardener himself, to let the earth of a matter settle, to see which small shoots pushed up unbidden. Yet he was aware that the town would not rest in similar patience. Already rumour sprouted faster than beans in a warm greenhouse. By nightfall it was widely reported that Horace had been poisoned with marrow wine, that he had choked on a stolen slice of sponge, that he had fallen victim to his own habit of drinking paraffin, in error for gin. At the rectory, Reverend Goff earnestly explained to his wife that the death would doubtless prove a warning to those who carried grudges. Mrs. Goff, who had known Horace's late wife and disliked her, murmured that grudges often sprang from reason. She thought it much more likely that Horace had simply overindulged, as men of his kind were apt to do. The market square, lit by its single lamp and the glow from the bakery window, became a forum. Men leaned on bicycles, women drew shawls tighter, and each added their own fragment to the growing mosaic. Mrs. Hopgood declared that as secretary she had a right to know whether the show must be postponed indefinitely. Mr. Riddle, still twitching with the anxiety of having presided over the disaster, insisted that the matter was entirely medical and quite unconnected with the society. A body collapsing in a shed was, he said, not the society's responsibility. Purbright, listening from the edge, heard them without appearing to. He nodded occasionally, his mild expression masking the quiet consideration behind it. He knew already that Horace's death would not be explained by onions or chrysanthemums, nor by vague mutterings about marrows. Somewhere, amid the overlapping tales, lay a truth concealed more by habit than by malice. As the evening closed, he walked home through the damp streets, the cobbles glistening from an earlier drizzle. From behind curtains came the drone of conversation, each house adding its little embroidery to the pattern. Purbright thought of Horace Dew as a man whose existence had been measured in rows of beans, quarrels about sheds, and small triumphs at the annual show. Such men did not often become subjects of police files, yet here he was, pressed between the onions and the whispers of Flaxborough, demanding some explanation that would not quite fit into the gossip. By the time the town settled to sleep, it had already divided itself into camps, those who believed Horace a victim of foul play, and those who thought him the author of his own end. In either case, reputations were being adjusted, suspicions watered like seedlings, and the inspector, alone in his modest rooms, permitted himself the smallest sigh. He was certain that only Flaxborough would not let the matter rest quietly, and nor, it seemed, could he. The following morning brought with it a pale sun that did little to lift the mist lying over the market square. Inspector Purbright arrived at the police station earlier than usual, not through urgency, but through habit, for he knew that by mid-morning the town's recollections would already be stiffening into certainties. It was always best to hear people before they had the chance to polish their tales to a civic sheen. He began with Mrs. Mallory, who presented herself without invitation. She swept into the office, carrying an air of solemn grievance, her handbag thudding against the chair as she sat. She repeated, in tones polished overnight, her discovery of the vandalized onions and the gallantry of Horace Dew. She had thought it only right to come forward, since the man's kind words to her might now, she supposed, bear the weight of sinister intent. Purbright listened with courteous gravity, though he wondered if Horace's admiration for chrysanthemums could reasonably be construed as a dying declaration. Still he noted her recollections in his mild hand, asking no questions that might excite her further narrative. Mr. Riddle, the chairman of the Allotment Society, was next. He appeared, as he so often did, to be in a state of apology for existing. He dabbed his brow with a folded handkerchief and assured the inspector that he had always urged a spirit of fair play amongst members. He had not personally observed Mr. Dew in distress, but had heard from Mrs. Hopgood that the man had seemed unusually affable. Riddle added, with the diffidence of one dropping an inconvenient truth, that Dew had occasionally overindulged in his own home-made wine, which was said to have the consistency of boot polish. The chairman did not wish to cast aspersions, but it was perhaps worth mentioning. Purbright thanked him, and Riddle left, visibly relieved, as though having confessed a venial sin. Constable Malley arrived shortly after with the enthusiasm of a hound that had scented rabbits. he reported that neighbours of Dew had spoken of quarrels, many of them, in fact. The most recent had been with Mr. Jenkin, whose plot bordered Dew's and who had accused him of stealing a length of gutter. Malley repeated with satisfaction Jenkin's remark that Dew would meet a bad end. To Malley this had the flavour of prophecy fulfilled. Purbright suggested mildly that Malley might go and ask Mr. Jenkin if he had anything further to add, preferably in words more specific than curses. Malley agreed, his disappointment imperfectly concealed. Later that day, Purbright walked down to the allotments himself. The rows of cabbages and beans stood solemn in the September damp, their leaves heavy with dew. The sheds, crooked and paint-flaked, leaned against one another like elderly conspirators. At Dew's plot, the soil was dark and well turned, showing the care of a man who had placed his faith in regular labour. A neighbour, Mrs. Talbot, looked up from her gooseberry bushes and nodded respectfully to the inspector. She volunteered that Horace had been a decent sort when sober, but rather too fond of correcting others on the spacing of their rows. She admitted, with a faint flush, that she had once struck him with a trug when he accused her of harbouring slugs. At the far end, Purbright found Mr. Jenkin himself, a wiry man with a permanent scowl. Jenkin declared that Horace Dew was a thief, a bully, and an interfering old fool. He had, however, not laid eyes on him since the previous afternoon, and had no intention of hastening his end. He claimed to have been at home cleaning his pigeon loft at the time of the show. Purbright observed that few men would invent such an alibi, and he noted it down with his usual calm. Jenkin, misinterpreting his silence, added defensively that half the town had wished Horace ill, and it was unfair to single him out. Purbright agreed politely and left him to his pigeons. By late afternoon, the inspector had gathered a small collection of impressions rather than facts. Horace Dew had been quarrelsome, perhaps fond of drink, certainly not universally admired. Yet he had also been oddly sociable at the show, by all accounts in good spirits. That sudden amiability, Purbright thought, might be more remarkable than his death. For men do not often change their temperaments in an hour, unless encouraged by something stronger than goodwill. He stopped at the coroner's office before returning to the station. Dr. Hilliard, who had conducted a preliminary examination, reported that Dew's heart was not robust, but had not failed of its own accord. There were traces in the stomach, he said, of alcohol far stronger than country wine. A flask had been found in Dew's coat pocket, half empty, smelling of brandy. It might well be the cause, Hilliard suggested. Yet he frowned as he said it, for the brandy had an oddly acrid note, more biting than it should have been. He would send samples for analysis. Purbright thanked him and walked back through the gathering dusk with the air of one who had had a suspicion quietly confirmed. At the station, Malley returned with his report on Jenkin. The man had indeed been seen tending his pigeons at the relevant time by two neighbours, who described him as shouting at the birds with his usual vigour. Malley admitted grudgingly that Jenkin might not have left his loft. Purbright only nodded and closed his notebook. He had no wish to pursue suspects too eagerly in Flaxborough. They had a way of presenting themselves, usually through overconfidence or gossip. For now, the inspector merely sat at his desk, listening to the quiet tick of the clock, and considered that Horace Dew's death had less to do with chance than with someone's choice, carefully concealed. The town, meanwhile, was settling into its favourite posture of waiting, watching itself as though on stage. By the time the lamps were lit, it was agreed in most parlours that Inspector Purbright would soon have the matter cleared up. The townsfolk took comfort in imagining their inspector proceeding with deliberate steps, never hurried, never flustered. And Purbright, sitting alone with his tea growing cold, was content to let them think so. for the truth was not yet clear, but it was moving towards him, quietly, like a figure approaching through fog. The morning after Dr. Hilliard's cautious report, Flaxborough had already promoted its own coroner's verdict. By the time Inspector Purbright left the station to walk across the square, the prevailing opinion was that Mr. Jenkin of the Pigeon Loft had finally made good on his threats. His quarrels with Horace Dew were common knowledge, his temper notorious, and his remark about Dew's bad end repeated in every shop until it had acquired the ring of prophecy. To the town, this seemed sufficient. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Hopgood declared it inevitable. She said she had always feared that the allotments would one day end in murder, and now she was proved right. At the butcher's counter, Mr. Bartlett said he was astonished it hadn't happened sooner, and in the snug of the Lamb and Flag, Jenkin himself was being discussed with such authority that he was practically convicted before his point was finished. Purbright, meanwhile, did not hasten to share their assurance. He received Mally's summary of the gossip with his usual mildness, though he noticed how the young constable's enthusiasm was sharpened by the prospect of an easy solution. Mally had even scribbled Jenkin's name at the top of his notebook with a flourish, as though the case might already be closed. Purbright suggested gently that a note written too boldly might leave little room for erasure. Mally reddened and muttered that he was only keeping things in order. Still, the procedure required that Jenkin be spoken to again. Purbright found him at the allotments, scattering feed among his pigeons, which flapped around him with the violence of a quarrel made airborne. Jenkin looked up with an expression that combined hostility with resignation. He was, after all, accustomed to being suspected of most things. He admitted readily that he had wished Horace Dew ill, and more than once. He had said as much in public, which everyone now seemed eager to remind him of. But he denied poisoning brandy or meddling with onions. His own hands, he said, were full enough with pigeons, which required more patience than wives and twice the cleanliness. Purbright listened without interruption, only remarking that witnesses had placed him with the pigeons at the relevant time. Jenkin nodded, pleased at last to be corroborated. Still, he added bitterly, if a man was disliked, he was bound to be guilty of something, whether he had done it or not. Purbright thanked him and left him standing amid the cooing and the flutter, his figure small against the neat geometry of the plots. Back at the station, Dr. Hilliard telephoned. The analysis had come through the brandy found in Dew's flask had been laced with wood alcohol, sufficient to cause collapse and death. It was not the kind of accident that came from careless distilling. Someone had taken deliberate trouble. Purbright noted the conclusion quietly, his pencil barely scratching the page. When Mally demanded triumphantly if this proved Jenkin's guilt, Purbright said only that it proved Horace Dew had not died of onions. The news of poison reached the town within hours, losing nothing in transmission. By tea-time, every respectable parlour was rehearsing the morality play of Horace Dew and his poisoned brandy. To most, the choice of suspect remained obvious. Who else but Jenkin, his neighbour and enemy, his threats ringing in every ear? To others, it was more complicated. Mrs. Mallory hinted darkly that Dew's sudden gallantry towards her might have concealed an attempt at distraction, and that someone jealous of his attentions had acted in haste. She left unsaid who that jealous party might be, but her friends filled in the blank readily enough. The more the talk spread, the more comfortable the town became with its suspect. Flaxborough had always preferred its mysteries to be solved quickly, and Jenkin's guilt had the neatness of a completed puzzle. Purbright, however, remained detached. He knew too well that the obvious in Flaxborough was often a disguise for the ordinary. That evening he sat at his desk, looking over the day's notes. He read again the accounts of Dew's behaviour at the show, affable, complimentary, even cheerful. A man who had spent years in quarrels had suddenly become sociable. Why? Was it merely drink, or was there something else, anticipation perhaps, of advantage or reconciliation? The inspector considered this quietly, his hand folded across the notebook. Malley returned to the theme of Jenkin, arguing that the town would never forgive the police if they failed to act. Purbright reminded him that it was not the town's forgiveness that concerned them, but the truth. He closed the notebook and rose, his movements unhurried. There was more to ask, but not of Jenkin. The man had already been condemned by gossip, and that, Purbright reflected, made him less, not more, likely to be the true culprit. Outside, the lamps had been lit, and the damp air carried the smell of coal fires. As Purbright walked through the square, he heard fragments of talk from doorways and windows, each repeating the same refrain, "Jenkin, Jenkin, Jenkin." The inspector walked on, his face calm, his step measured. But in his mind he was already turning towards another question, not who hated Horace Dew, for that was too easy, but who had reason to change the brandy in his pocket, and why it had been done at a show where the whole town was watching. By midweek, the gossip that had once swirled about poisoned onions and jealous allotment rivals had begun to lose its novelty. People repeated themselves too often, and even the more inventive scandalmongers discovered they were only varying the order of their accusations. What Flaxborough needed, as it always did, was a fresh scrap of peculiarity to keep the matter alive. It arrived not in the form of some dramatic revelation, but as a remark made in passing, one that might have been ignored by anyone less patient than Inspector Purbright. He was walking the narrow corridor of the station when Mrs. Hopgood swept in with her usual mixture of indignation and self-importance. She carried a sheaf of papers relating to the Allotment Society's accounts, which she insisted might prove helpful to the investigation. Purbright accepted them with courtesy, knowing that nothing in those columns of halfpence and seed subscriptions would have the least bearing on Horace Dew's end. But it was not the papers that mattered. It was her remark, delivered almost as an afterthought, that set a faint glimmer in Purbright's mind. She said she could not understand how Horace had managed to find the time to attend the show at all, given that he had been so insistent about guarding his shed that week. He had told her, only 2 days before his death, that someone had been tampering with his tools. A hoe had gone missing and later reappeared in quite the wrong place. She thought it was a fuss over nothing, but Horace had been unusually agitated. She laughed, with the self-satisfaction of one who always discounts other people's anxieties, and said it was probably just his forgetfulness. Then she left, content in the belief she had been useful. Purbright sat for some time after she had gone, considering the matter. A missing hoe might mean nothing. Yet it was curious that Horace, who was by all accounts a man inclined to pettiness, had been so troubled as to speak of it twice in a single week. Even more curious that he had not mentioned it to anyone else, so far as the inspector knew. Tools did not usually wander on their own, nor did they vanish and reappear without a reason. That afternoon, Purbright walked down to the allotments again. The mist had lifted, and the late sun struck the sheds at an angle that emphasized their decay. Dew's shed, padlocked now and awaiting further search, stood neat enough. A rake leaned against the wall, and a wheelbarrow tilted on one side like a drunk propped against a lamp-post. Purbright looked carefully at the ground. He was not a man inclined to expect footprints or dramatic traces, but he did notice a patch of soil that seemed to have been turned and then hastily smoothed. A small thing, and not in itself remarkable, but he made a mental note of it. As he was standing there, Mrs. Talbot appeared once more, wiping her hands on a faded apron. She spoke readily, as allotment holders so often did, when provided with the faintest excuse. She said she had thought it strange that Horace had not carried his usual flask on the morning of the show. He always brought it with him, tucked in his jacket pocket, and often refreshed himself discreetly before noon. On that morning, however, she had seen him leave his shed without it. When he arrived later at the hall, he had it again. She assumed he had forgotten it and gone back for it. But now, she wondered. Purbright thanked her gently and walked away, turning the thought over. A man known for guarding his flask suddenly without it, then later with it again. Between those two moments, who had access? And how had it been exchanged or altered without his notice? The inspector did not yet shape the question into words, but the unease settled into him like a pebble in the shoe, small, persistent, not easily ignored. He returned to the station and asked Mally, in his mildest voice, to make a list of all those who had been near the allotment sheds on the morning of the show. Mally brightened at the task, his pencil racing across the page, as if the names themselves might leap out and incriminate their owners. He returned with a list that included most of the society's committee, several competitors, and a boy who had been chasing a stray rabbit. Purbright studied it without comment, though his eyes lingered on one or two names. That evening, Flaxborough resumed its chorus of speculation, but the inspector kept his reflections to himself. He thought not of quarrels or threats, but of a misplaced hoe, a smoothed patch of soil, and a flask that had disappeared and returned altered. These were trifles in the eyes of the town, easily overlooked. Yet in Purbright's quiet experience it was always the trifles that proved most obstinate. They resisted the smoothing hand of gossip, they refused to be ignored, and in their very smallness they hinted at something carefully hidden. He sat alone in his office as the street outside grew dark, the lamplight glinting faintly on the rows of files. Somewhere among the neat, everyday lives of Flaxborough, someone had slipped brandy into a flask and put it back where Horace Dew would trust it. It was not malice alone that explained such a thing, it was planned. And Purbright, with his patient calm, recognized the feel of a hand that had taken care not to be seen. By the following morning, Inspector Purbright had begun to extend his inquiries beyond the obvious suspects and familiar quarrels. Flaxborough, he knew, was a town of layered grievances, small injustices carefully noted and stored, waiting only for the right opportunity to emerge. Horace Dew's death had created precisely such an opportunity, and those layers were now revealing themselves, though subtly, like concentric ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Purbright started with the committee members of the Allotment Society. Mrs. Hopgood, already a source of endless commentary, was surprisingly reticent about her own movements on the morning of the show. She admitted only that she had been fussing over the prize cards and ensuring the hall was tidy, though the inspector noted a slight hesitation when she mentioned the wine table. It was a minor hesitation, almost invisible, yet it registered in his mind. Mrs. Hopgood was meticulous, but even meticulous people could be careless in moments of distraction or concealment. Mr. Riddle, the chairman, provided his usual stream of nervous commentary. He had been wandering between the allotments, making polite inquiries about preparation, he said, yet he could not account for a half-hour stretch before the show began. He suggested it was nothing, a trivial lapse, but Purbright recorded it, as he recorded everything that did not quite fit, knowing that trifles were often clues in disguise. Meanwhile, Mrs. Talbot, the neighbour of Dew's plot, added a quiet observation that had been overlooked. She mentioned that a stranger had appeared briefly near the sheds on the morning of the show, a man who carried no baskets, no tools, nothing to suggest he was part of the society. He had lingered long enough to be noticed and then vanished in the direction of the High Street. Purbright thanked her politely and made a note a new figure, transient but observed, might explain the oddities of Dew's morning, the missing flask, the disturbed soil, the anxious talk of disappearing tools. He then visited the creamery where a small crowd gathered each morning to discuss local events over tea and bread. Here, a different facet of human behavior presented itself. Mr. Lum, the dairyman, spoke of quarrels between Dew and Mrs. Sloane, another allotment holder, over the rights to the path dividing their plots. Dew had threatened, Lum said, to block her way with his wheelbarrow. Mrs. Sloane, testy but composed, insisted she had dealt only in mild protest, but admitted she had locked her gate for several mornings to prevent his intrusion. Purbright noted the repeated friction. These were small grievances, petty in isolation, but they created a network of motive that spread across the allotment community. By afternoon, the inspector had traced the paths and timings of those present on the morning of the show. Every plot told a story. Some, like Jenkins, were well alibied and noisy in corroboration. Others, like Mrs. Sloane's, revealed minor inconsistencies, lapses of attention that, though innocent, could conceal more deliberate movements. Even young George Blakey, who had first discovered the body, provided a careful timeline of when he had seen which plot holders arrive and depart. The boy's recollections were not precise to the minute, but they were sufficient to rule out some possibilities and highlight the curious those who appeared in one place and then another with unexpected efficiency. Purbright returned to Dew's shed once more, his attention caught by a modest pile of tools in a corner. He turned over the hoe that had once gone missing and replaced itself in the dust. Its handle bore a faint mark, a scratch that seemed recent, a trivial detail and yet consistent with Mrs. Hopgood's remark about Dew's agitation. Someone had handled the tools, moved them, or perhaps sought to find something among them. The inspector touched the handle lightly, feeling the evidence of deliberate disturbance, and tucked the observation into the quiet recesses of his mind. The inspector's evening walk took him past the hall and through the town's narrow lanes. At each window, curtains twitched, lights glimmered over polished tables and hearths. Flaxborough was a town watching itself, and Purbright noted who lingered too long at the edge of the square, who looked more curious than casual, who spoke too much or too little when the question of Dew arose. Small movements, faint gestures, and trivialities all became part of the tapestry he was assembling. By nightfall, the net of attention had widened. The suspect field was no longer limited to Jenkin, nor to those with direct quarrels with Dew. It included the committee, the neighbours, even strangers whose presence had been fleeting but observant. And somewhere within this field of small, overlapping human motives, Purbright knew, lay the person who had taken the brandy, the tools, and the opportunity to act while everyone else looked the other way. The town, blissfully unaware, was constructing its own narrative, neat, morally satisfying, and entirely premature. The inspector, alone in his office, sipped cold tea and allowed the quiet satisfaction of unseen progress to settle around him. He had widened the circle, observed the faint disturbances, and above all, paid attention to the trivialities that others dismissed. In these, he sensed, was the pattern that would ultimately explain the death of Horace Dew. Flaxborough, for all its accustomed rhythm, was not a town to endure one scandal alone. On the Thursday morning following Horace Dew's death, a second incident occurred that shifted the tone of public speculation and demanded a fresh glance from Inspector Purbright. It began, as many minor shocks do, in a quiet way. The postmistress, Miss Toller, had arrived early, as was her habit, to sort letters and parcels before the town awoke fully. In the corner of the sorting room she discovered a small envelope, unmarked except for the words, "For the Society," written in a spidery hand. Within it was a single note and a miniature bottle of brandy. The note was brief, almost cryptic. "Some truths cannot wait. Beware the shed." Miss Toller, naturally anxious, alerted Mrs. Hopgood, who in turn rang the station. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, a small gathering of curious post office customers had assembled. He accepted the note and bottle with polite gravity, carefully tucking them into an envelope for further examination. His expression suggested little, though his mind worked steadily. The effect on the town was immediate. Gossip spread faster than the mist across the high street, and already the blame for the note and the bottle was being apportioned. Some suggested it was a hoax, a cruel trick played by the local children. Others speculated it must be the work of a remorseful neighbour come to confess in the understated style Flaxborough favoured. Few stopped to consider that it might instead be a further piece of careful orchestration by a deliberate hand. Purbright's first step was to trace the envelope. Miss Toller remembered nothing unusual about its delivery, and none of the customers claimed to have seen the hand that placed it on the counter. The handwriting, however, was unfamiliar, sloping and neat, with a cautious steadiness that suggested practice. He made a note to have it compared with the committee's correspondences, as well as with the letters of Dew himself, who had been, by reputation, punctilious in his communications. While Mally fussed over the envelope and bottle, the inspector returned to Dew's shed. The padlock remained secure, but the floor outside bore signs of disturbance. Someone had visited in the night, stepping lightly, yet leaving impressions enough for a trained eye to discern that they had circled the shed twice before departing. The inspector examined the marks carefully and noted their direction, depth, and pattern. A single boot, ordinary in appearance, but placed with deliberation, left a subtle trail, someone entering with care, not haste, not panic, someone confident enough to touch no surface unnecessarily. By mid-morning, Purbright had begun interviewing additional allotment holders, expanding the field even further. Mrs. Sloane repeated her previous account, noting she had seen a stranger moving among the plots on Wednesday evening. She could not describe him clearly, save to say he wore a brown coat and walked with a peculiar, almost measured gait. A boy, Timothy Hedges, added that he had glimpsed a figure slipping from plot to plot, occasionally stopping to lift a tool or glance at a flask tucked into a coat pocket. The details were fragmentary, yet they were consistent with Mrs. Talbot's earlier observation. Purbright considered these accounts carefully. The first death had seemed immediate, a simple collapse from poisoned brandy, yet this second episode indicated premeditation. The note, the bottle, the furtive visitor, they all pointed to someone moving deliberately through the town, orchestrating events with attention to timing, sequence, and misdirection. It was not merely the quarrels of neighbours that explained Dew's end. It was calculated, careful, and designed to appear coincidental. He returned briefly to the police station to review the growing list of names, locations, and alibis. Patterns began to emerge, those present at the hall on the morning of the show, those with access to the shed and tools, those whose handwriting, temperament, and routine permitted both the opportunity and the foresight to tamper with Dew's brandy. Each thread, considered alone, was inconclusive. Together they formed a lattice that suggested intent and knowledge. By afternoon, Purbright had concluded that the second incident was not a distraction, but a continuation of the same plan. The bottle and note were meant to create alarm, to test the town's attention, to see how far people would speculate, and perhaps to provoke a confession or a slip. He made a quiet note to question those whose routines allowed access to both the allotment and the postal arrangements committee members, neighbours, and the occasional casual visitor. The town, unaware of these quiet calculations, carried on with its routines, though unease had crept into parlours and shops alike. Mrs. Mallory whispered to Mrs. Glossop that perhaps Horace's death had been only the beginning, and Mr. Riddle fretted over whether the show's trophies could safely be returned to their rightful owners. Through it all, Purbright remained calm, walking the lanes, observing the smallest gestures, noting the faint inconsistencies that most overlooked. By evening he returned to his office and reviewed his notes. He had widened his field once more, accounted for every visitor, and considered every oddity: the missing tools, the disturbed soil, the mysteriously moved flask, and, now, the note and bottle. Each was a trivial detail, innocuous on its own, but together they formed a trajectory toward the true author of Horace Dew's demise. Purbright, alone in the quiet glow of his lamp, allowed himself a small, satisfied thought the case was no longer a simple quarrel gone wrong. The town's obvious suspect might soon be revealed as entirely peripheral. The game, he reflected, had grown subtle, and Flaxborough's neat explanations would no longer suffice. That evening, Inspector Purbright settled into the quiet of his modest sitting room, the gaslight casting a pale circle on the desk where the day's notes lay in disciplined disorder. Outside, the town murmured with its usual after-hours conversation, faint and indistinct, like the distant lapping of water against a quay. In the lamplight he considered not the obvious quarrels, nor the gossip that had transformed Jenkin into a public villain, but the subtle threads he had observed: the missing hoe, the disturbed soil, the flask that had vanished only to return, altered, the brief glimpse of a stranger, and now the anonymous bottle and note sent to the post office. Purbright reflected, as he often did, on the character of Flaxborough. It was a town where small grievances fermented quietly, where alliances formed and broke over minor slights, and where every man and woman carefully measured public manners against private ambition. The outwardly mundane often concealed a meticulous order, and vice versa. It was in these unnoticed moments, the inspector knew, that a crime of subtle cunning might flourish. He thought of Horace Dew, a man not universally loved, but hardly one to inspire calculated malice. Dew's sudden civility at the show remained in his mind, a curious departure from his usual quarrelsome manner. A man does not, Purbright considered, change temperament abruptly unless motivated by something more than mere habit. It was the quality of his cheer, the almost staged nature of his compliments, that suggested a presence of mind aware of being observed and perhaps cautious of expectation. The tools, too, troubled him. A misplaced hoe might seem trivial to the townsfolk, yet it indicated that someone had been inside Dew's shed. Small things, Purbright knew, often carried the weight of intent, and he allowed himself to imagine the movements of a careful intruder, the handling of implements, the discreet lifting of a flask, the measured steps across the soil to avoid detection. Opportunity, timing, and knowledge combined to form the precise circumstances that made deliberate action possible. He considered the anonymous note and bottle and how the sender must have understood the town's rhythms, the predictable dispersal of attention. A delivery through the post office ensured observation, yet avoided immediate confrontation. The message was both a warning and a challenge, an attempt to unsettle the community, perhaps even to test the alertness of the local constabulary. Purbright recognized the patience required to plan such gestures. It was not the work of a careless or passionate enemy, but of someone used to moving with deliberation. Flaxborough itself appeared innocent in the lamplight. The square lay empty, the shops darkened, the occasional window glowing softly with domestic life. And yet every house had its stories, minor jealousies, quiet rivalries, the petty injustices that, when compounded, could drive a person to subtle cruelty. Purbright thought of Mrs. Mallory, vigilant for slights against her onions of Mrs. Sloane, protective of her path of Riddle and Hopgood, each anxious to maintain order and decorum, and of Jenkin, already the town's convenient scapegoat. Each had reason to act in trivial ways that might become important only when combined with other, more deliberate actions. He sipped cold tea, unhurried, and allowed his mind to wander over the possibilities. The true perpetrator, he reflected, would not be the obvious enemy, nor the one whose quarrels were public and rehearsed. They would be someone who could move unnoticed, who understood the predictability of the town's gaze, who had access to Dew's shed and to the flask itself. In short, someone who could orchestrate both incident and misdirection with subtlety. The inspector thought too much of the timing. Horace's demise had occurred at a moment when the hall was crowded, when attention was focused elsewhere. The second incident, the note and bottle, tested reactions, gauging which neighbours were observant, which were easily alarmed. Purbright considered the psychological effect, the deliberate planting of evidence to create confusion, the prompting of suspicion toward the first obvious suspect. The sophistication required suggested a calm mind, one attuned to small details and local behaviour. By the time the gaslight flickered low, Purbright had mapped in his mind a lattice of opportunity, motive, and observation. It was not a lattice of passion or rage, but of patient calculation. He noted without haste that the town's eagerness for closure was both a tool and a hindrance. Gossip would mislead, public conjecture would cloud, and yet the same gossip revealed what people overlooked, what they assumed inconsequential. As night deepened, he sat back, considering each individual committee members, neighbours, occasional visitors, and the fleeting stranger glimpsed near the sheds. He weighed each trifling action, each subtle deviation from routine. And in that quiet reflection, Purbright recognized the truth that only careful observation and patient attention could uncover. The murderer would be revealed not by the loudest quarrel or the most visible enemy, but by the hand that moved deliberately among the ordinary, leaving signs only the most observant could detect. The following morning, Purbright returned to the allotments with a purpose more subtle than overt investigation. It was not merely to observe, question, or record, but to engage the town in a way that might elicit what the most obvious inquiries could not. A slip, a remark, a hint of nervousness from someone accustomed to moving undetected. The inspector believed in the gentle art of testing, implanting opportunities for the guilty to reveal themselves without coercion, like observing a fish nibbling at a lure. He began with a casual walk along the rows of cabbages, beans, and tomatoes, greeting familiar faces with mild civility. Each plot holder responded predictably with nods, brief comments about the weather, or small boasts about their horticultural success. Only a few seemed truly concerned, and those were typically the ones whose movements he already noted with interest. Purbright paused by Mrs. Sloane's plot, where the gate had once been a point of minor contention with Dew. He remarked on the neatness of the soil and the health of her plants, as if it were casual appreciation. Mrs. Sloane, pleased, mentioned that she had been careful to guard her path since the quarrel, yet she laughed lightly about how old quarrels seemed less pressing in light of recent events. Purbright made no comment, but he noted the shift in tone. Her laughter seemed measured, a little too easy, as though designed to put him at ease. He continued to Mr. Riddle, standing by the compost heap, arranging the layers of decomposing leaves and vegetable matter with meticulous care. Purbright inquired, without urgency, whether Mr. Riddle had noticed anything unusual during the setup for the show. Riddle hesitated slightly, then admitted a brief absence in the early morning, saying only that he had gone to speak with a supplier about steaks for the Marrows. The inspector smiled faintly, noting the careful phrasing, the avoidance of unnecessary detail. Next, he walked to the shed once occupied by Dew, now padlocked and cordoned off. He spoke aloud to no one in particular, that it was remarkable how careful Dew had been in arranging his tools, and how unusual it was for anything to be moved or mishandled. This casual statement, seemingly unconnected, was intended to test reactions. He observed the faces of those nearby, noting who lingered a moment too long, who shifted uneasily, who glanced furtively toward the shed. His attention settled on a figure at the far end of the plots, Mr. Lum, the dairyman, who had earlier supplied tea to the society. Lum's posture stiffened slightly, and he glanced quickly toward the inspector, then away. Purbright noted, with his customary calm, that the man's attention seemed divided between observation and concealment. It was minor, a flicker of hesitation, yet sufficient to warrant further inquiry. Later, Purbright visited the post office where Miss Toller recounted the delivery of the anonymous note and bottle once more. Purbright expressed mild curiosity about the handwriting, its sloping neatness, and the choice of envelope. Miss Toller added that she had seen a hand slip the envelope onto the counter, swift and careful, yet with a particular angle of approach, as though the sender anticipated being watched. The inspector filed this quietly, aware that careful observation often revealed more than confessions. Returning to the station, he arranged a small meeting of committee members, ostensibly to discuss Dew's plots and the arrangements for the next show. He allowed conversation to drift casually to the morning of the incident, praising each participant for their diligence. Then, with gentle precision, he asked a hypothetical question about a misplaced flask and what steps a person might take if they discovered it had been tampered with. The room fell silent for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Some murmured that such an occurrence would be unlikely. Others claimed, perhaps too readily, that they would never meddle in another's possessions. Purbright observed each reaction with his usual calm, noting micro-expressions, hesitant glances, and the subtle avoidance of eye contact. By mid-afternoon, patterns began to emerge. Certain individuals responded with ease and certainty, others with mild anxiety or overcompensation. Purbright understood that the guilty, when prompted indirectly, revealed themselves not in words but in the spaces between words, the hesitations, the tiny shifts in posture. He had created an environment in which the perpetrator might stumble without overt confrontation. That evening, walking home through the empty streets, Purbright reflected on the cumulative observations of the displaced hoe, the disturbed soil, the vanished flask, the anonymous note, and the behavioral subtleties displayed during casual inquiry. Each thread, minor in isolation, had been woven into a broader tapestry of opportunity, motive, and action. He understood that the next steps would involve focused questioning, yet the stage was now set. The town's public assumption that Jenkin had acted alone was not only premature but misleading. Purbright's test had revealed the faintest of cracks in the careful facade maintained by the true perpetrator. He allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. In Flaxborough, appearances mattered greatly, but human nature, he knew, was rarely consistent. Opportunity, observation, and the patient orchestration of events had begun to uncover what the town assumed hidden. And for the first time, Purbright had a sense of the direction in which the next decisive phase of the inquiry would move. The following afternoon, Inspector Purbright invited the key figures to the hall once more, not as a tribunal but as a quiet assembly in which he would, in his characteristically gentle manner, explain what had occurred. The room was arranged without formality, chairs in a semicircle, the committee, and a few select neighbours facing the space where he would stand. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long, mellow stripes across the polished floor. He began with a mild recounting of the show, the Marrows and the death of Horace Dew, speaking slowly, deliberately. He reminded them of the incidents, the peculiar details, the missing hoe, the disturbed soil outside Dew's shed, the flask that had disappeared only to return, altered, the brief appearances of strangers, the note and bottle sent through the post office. Each event he described as a small, almost incidental curiosity, leaving the room to draw its own conclusions. Then he turned, subtly, to the reactions he had observed during his private inquiries. The hesitation over casual remarks, the slight tremor of acknowledgement when discussing tampered possessions, the careful avoidance of eye contact. He spoke of human nature, of how small anxieties and minor deceptions often reveal what the loudest claims attempt to conceal. It was a patient, unhurried monologue, leaving the listeners with the impression that the inspector was more interested in social observation than accusation, and yet he noted opportunity had been carefully constructed. The morning of the show, someone had manipulated circumstances so that Horace Dew would find himself with a flask altered to contain wood alcohol sufficient to cause collapse. The movement of tools, the brief access to the shed, the monitoring of Dew's routine, all these were part of a sequence executed with deliberate care. Purbright paused, allowing a silence to grow in the room. Then, with the same calm courtesy, he remarked that while Jenkin had been an obvious suspect, his alibi, confirmed by multiple witnesses and pigeons in full flight, exonerated him from the fatal act. He noted that suspicion often follows the loudest quarrels and the most visible rivalries, but the quiet hand, the one unnoticed, was frequently the true agent of consequence. Eyes shifted around the room. Some faces showed mild surprise, others a flicker of unease. Purbright continued, noting the small behavioral traces of those who had lingered by Dew's shed without clear purpose, those who had observed the movements of others more closely than their own, and the one who had shown subtle anxiety when the inspector discussed tampering with flasks. He paused once more, allowing the implication to settle without overt accusation. Then he revealed the final piece, the handwriting of the anonymous note and the precise movements of the bottle's delivery. When compared with the correspondences and routines of the allotment committee, it became clear that the orchestrator had combined opportunity with meticulous knowledge of Dew's habits and the predictable attention of the townsfolk. All eyes rested on Mrs. Hopgood, whose small gasp was the only audible sound in the room. She reddened slightly, yet maintained the composure expected of a woman long accustomed to authority. Purbright, with a tone of gentle civility, explained how her role had provided both the opportunity and the means of access to Dew's shed under the guise of official business, knowledge of his routines, and the ability to slip the bottle and note through the post office unnoticed. Her motives, he noted without judgment, had been a mixture of perceived slight, control over the society's events, and a desire to assert authority in a town where minor disputes were given great weight. Mrs. Hopgood, cornered but composed, admitted in a quiet voice that she had intended no real harm, that she had meant only to frighten Dew, to correct what she saw as disorder in the society. She had not realized that the brandy would cause such a collapse, and she seemed genuinely dismayed at the consequences of her careful manipulations. Purbright nodded, his expression calm, the satisfaction in his eyes tempered by an awareness that human error often trailed behind even the most deliberate of actions. The assembly dispersed gradually, the townsfolk absorbing both the explanation and the relief that the perpetrator had been found. Jenkin, surprisingly, offered a quiet nod to the inspector, acknowledging that suspicion had been misdirected, but that justice, subtle and understated, had been served. Others returned to their homes, their murmured conversations now tempered with new understanding and reflection on the unexpected consequences of trivial grievances. Purbright returned to his desk at the station, the hall empty but for the echoes of his careful account. He allowed himself a brief, contented sigh, reviewing the sequence of small details, patient observations, and deliberate tests that had revealed the truth. In Flaxborough, the quiet orchestration of human nature, the patterns of habit and oversight, had been sufficient to uncover the culprit. All that remained was routine paperwork, the satisfaction of a case resolved, and the calm knowledge that the town would resume its rhythms with subtle adjustments, its reputations reshaped, but its ordinary order largely intact. The next morning, Flaxborough awoke with a peculiar calm. The Allotment Society's hall had reopened for business as usual, the prize marrows and cucumbers replaced by fresh arrangements, and the chatter of villagers, though subdued, carried a note of cautious satisfaction. The town had digested the revelation of Mrs. Hopgood's inadvertent orchestration of Horace Dew's demise, and life, as Purbright suspected, would resume with only subtle alterations in social habits. At the station, the inspector went over the final reports. Dr. Hilliard had completed the analysis of the brandy, confirming the presence of wood alcohol in quantities sufficient to explain Dew's collapse. Malley had compiled statements, timelines, and observations into a neat file. Purbright reviewed them with his customary patience, noting once more the sequence of minor details that had led him inexorably to the truth: the missing hoe, the carefully smoothed soil, the flask that vanished and returned, the fleeting stranger, and the anonymous note and bottle. The satisfaction for Purbright was not dramatic. There had been no chase, no confrontation, no explosive confession. The town's justice had been largely procedural and social, but the detective's own sense of order lay in the clarity with which events had been reconstructed. Each small observation had been accounted for, each quirk and hesitation recorded, and each seemingly trivial action placed within the framework of motive and opportunity. Walking through the market square later that morning, Purbright observed the town's ordinary routines with quiet attention. Mrs. Mallory fussed over her onions with renewed energy, though she cast occasional glances at her neighbours, gauging their reactions with the faint curiosity peculiar to the socially attentive. Mr. Riddle fussed over the allotment plots, ensuring that stakes and supports were in perfect order. Jenkin moved among his pigeons, offering no comment, content that suspicion had been directed elsewhere. Flaxborough, as always, managed its own moral equilibrium, adjusting and readjusting to accommodate both error and revelation. Purbright, strolling past the hall, noted the small alterations in behaviour. A gate left slightly ajar, a tool returned to a different spot, the careful alignment of seed trays. These minor adjustments spoke of lessons learned, social order restored, and human caution sharpened by experience. Yet the essential rhythm of the town remained unchanged. The Allotment Society would continue, the markets would open and close, and the exchange of gossip, carefully balanced between fact and embellishment, would proceed with its usual understated charm. Returning to the station, Purbright settled at his desk, the reports and correspondence now organized to his satisfaction. The case of Horace Dew's death, though unusual in its orchestration, had been resolved through observation, patience, and the attentive study of human behavior. There was a small pleasure in the neatness of it, in the quiet triumph of understanding what had appeared chaotic and confusing to the town at large. He poured himself a small cup of tea and considered the town outside his window. Flaxborough had learned nothing in words, perhaps, but the rhythm of attention, of trust, and of social awareness had subtly shifted. Individuals moved with slight modifications, watching their neighbours with the mild caution that comes from awareness of unforeseen consequences. In the inspector's mind, that was as significant as any formal resolution. Human nature, once revealed, leaves traces that endure far beyond the formal accounting of facts. Malley, peering over the stack of statements, asked if the case was truly concluded. Purbright nodded. The perpetrator had been identified, the method explained, and the motives understood. Justice, subtle and understated as ever, had been served without drama or excess. The town would gossip, as towns do, but the essential facts had been established, and the pattern of events reconstructed with precision. As the afternoon wore on, Purbright returned to his habitual paperwork, the quiet hum of the station offering its customary comfort. Outside, Flaxborough carried on with the business of ordinary life, the shops open, the post delivered, the lanes echoing with the sound of children and the occasional bark of a dog. The incident of Horace Dew's death, though remarkable in its subtleties, would soon be absorbed into the town's collective memory, transformed into the sort of anecdote repeated at future shows and market gatherings, its lessons acknowledged quietly, its drama understated. Purbright leaned back in his chair, gazing at the neat stack of reports. The town, its secrets and small deceits laid bare for a time, would continue in its measured rhythm, ever watchful, ever human. And in that knowledge the inspector allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile before returning to the quiet work of ensuring order, observation, and understanding prevailed, as always, in Flaxborough.